So as a safety precaution, Ethiopian Airlines grounded all Boeing 737 MAX 8 fleet until further notice. China has followed suit, as did Singapore, Indonesia, South Korea, Mongolia, Aeromexico, our own COMAIR, as well as GOL, the Brazilian airline, and the list goes on. Even as we're speaking, more and more countries are doing the same. According to the South African Civil Aviation Authority, there are 2 planes of this kind on the South African aircraft register belonging to one operator, and only one of them is actually in operation. So let's talk about this further. Via Skype, we're joined by Guy Leitch. He's the editor and publisher of SA Flyer magazine. Guy, thanks very much, and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Leanne. Nice to be with you.
So we talk about, in the introduction, the one aircraft that's still flying. Is this in the SAA fleet? Has this been grounded, or is it still working?
No, in fact, there is only one aircraft of the 737-8 MAX type in South Africa, and that was imported by COMAIR about 2 weeks ago. There may be a second one on the register, but it hasn't yet been delivered. The one flying with COMAIR is in fact in British Airways livery and has been flying Johannesburg, Cape Town regularly since it arrived.
Yeah, okay. So we saw yesterday, quite a lot of pressure being put on COMAIR, and we saw them announcing that they've grounded their flight. So it seems like, you know, people are very skeptical about getting onto this aircraft again. Talk to us a little bit about
very
it.
much.
Go for it, please.
Very much so. COMAIR initially said that they wouldn't ground this aircraft, which was, I thought, an extremely poor decision, because people were phoning me, and I presume many others, asking, well, how do they tell if the plane that they're going to get on is the the 8 MAX or the older 737-800 type, which has now got a very good safety record. And it's very hard to tell them apart. So obviously clients or passengers were really concerned and were beginning to cancel COMAIR flights. And also, of course, the risk that COMAIR was running was huge. If they had an incident, it would have bankrupted the airline, I'm quite convinced. So it was necessary for them to show some leadership and actually ground their aircraft themselves, rather than wait for Boeing or the Civil Aviation Authority or the American Federal Aviation Authority to ground the aircraft.
Yeah. You know, I'm seeing that there's also pressure on a lot of the airlines to ground not only the MAX 8, but also having a look at the MAX 7, 9, and 10. Tell us a little bit about this aircraft.
That's correct. Well, they're all of the latest generation of Boeing 737s. The Boeing 737 is an incredibly well-tested, well-proven design. In fact, it is the most successful airliner ever built. The first ones flew over 50 years ago now, in 1965, and over approximately 10,000 have been delivered. This MAX version is the very latest version. Boeing have already built and sold and delivered over 350 of them, which are flying around the world. And if you think about it, they're all flying 4 or 5 times a day. So, you know, they're doing over 1,000 flights a day on that. That makes them relatively safe, but obviously these 2 accidents are more than the traveling public should be able to bear, especially because they're so similar. It suggests that the causes of the Lion Air crash off Jakarta haven't been dealt with by the manufacturer properly, or by the necessary training that was put in place to try and fix the situation. So until we get a proper finding from the Ethiopian air crash, I think that it's much safer to keep the aeroplanes on the ground. The real issue here is that the MAX is a significant upgrade of the previous so-called NG series. We know it as the 737-800, in that it's got new engines and it's got new wings, and it's got new, supposedly enhanced or improved safety systems, particularly autopilot systems. And the system that has been accused or is suspected of being the problem with the Lion Air and this now Ethiopian crash is an auto trim system that automatically restores the trim of the aircraft if it goes out because it's flying too nose high in the air, for instance. It forces the nose down, and there are signs that it took over control from the pilots and forced the nose all the way down into the ground. That's obviously a very simplistic explanation, but until Boeing can get to the bottom of that, then I think it's best that the aircraft stays on the ground.
Have we heard from Boeing? And I think that's an important angle in this entire story. What have they said about this?
Obviously, I mean, this Boeing is under enormous pressure. The share price dropped by over 12% when it opened yesterday morning after the Sunday morning crash. It's recovered back to about 6% down, but the Boeing 737 series accounts for 50% of Boeing's total revenues. So they can't afford this aircraft not to be right. What they've done is they've issued an immediate, essentially what we would call an airworthiness notification, reminding operators of what the circumstances might be that would lead to this, let's call it an auto trim problem, and how pilots are expected to deal with it. Basically, the pilots are required to know how to reach two switches to switch the two circuits that control it off and isolate it completely out of the aircraft. But, you know, the signs are that the Ethiopian aircraft was porpoising wildly all over the sky with enormous variations in height before it crashed. And that would suggest that it could be very difficult indeed for the pilots to bring about this remedial action.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the two incidences, because, I mean, they've just happened a couple of months apart, and both of them are brand new aircraft. I mean, we look at Lion Air, then we look at Ethiopian Air. And I know it's still very early in the investigations, but they both seem to have crashed very close to takeoff. I mean, this particular incident was 6 minutes after takeoff, and you were explaining the situation. Can we draw a parallel between what's happened between the two of them?
Very much so. The Lion Air crash, as you pointed out, happened about 11 or 12 minutes after takeoff. The Ethiopian crash happened just 6 minutes after takeoff. But the reports from the cockpit were very similar. The pilots were communicating with the air traffic controllers, in both instances saying that they were having inconsistent or irregular airspeed indications. And that's a key input into the autopilot or an auto trim system. And in the Lion Air crash, a bad angle of attack information, which, as I said, indicates the actual, if you like, the angle that the aircraft is going up. Once after takeoff, the aircraft is supposed to climb at a steady speed and rate as it climbs up to, let's say, 37,000 feet. And on the radar returns that we're seeing from, for instance, the generally available radar services that are available to the public, you can see clearly that the aircraft stopped gaining height and then started going up and down enormously, presumably as the pilots fought with this auto trim system, and then eventually it overpowered them.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. I'm busy reading about it's the American Aviation Authority, and they are not being dramatic right now. They're not grounding any of the fleets. They're not taking any specific angle. Why are they sort of lagging behind? Is there something they know that we don't know?
No, I don't think it's that simple. I think it's much more prosaic. I think it's simply an issue of bottom lines. No, it's putting profit before people, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
They don't know. They believe in their product. They believe in the incredible rigors that these aircraft have to go to be certified as and approved for flight by the American Federal Aviation Administration. And it is an incredibly thorough process. This is still a relatively isolated problem, but obviously two is too many. And I suspect that we might hear today that the Federal Aviation Administration will ground the aircraft pending some sort of finalization from the initial findings of the Ethiopian crash, or a more satisfactory solution from Boeing.
I think we need to also just spend perhaps a minute talking about Ethiopian Airlines, because, you know, there's never a conversation that doesn't involve Ethiopian Airline and it being a real gem on the African continent. It's grown, it's got a great reputation, it's a state airline that is showing profitability, and it was just gathering so much good around it, and then this happens. Obviously, this is going to cost a lot of damage to its reputation and dent the airline quite severely. But just let's perhaps get your impressions of the whole airline and what this is going to do to it.
Yeah, indeed, as you say, Ethiopian is the star airline of the African continent. It's gone from being a relatively insignificant third after South African Airways and Kenya Airways to becoming by far the largest and most successful in terms of profitability airline in Africa. And it's had a pretty good safety record. It needs to be said that South African Airways' safety record is still far better than Ethiopian Airways. South African Airways hadn't had a fatal accident since the Helderberg nearly 30 years ago, whereas Ethiopian had had a 737 loss after takeoff in 2010 into the Mediterranean off Beirut. So, the airline was, you could say, still having teething problems, but it has the youngest fleet. It's got the latest and the best aircraft, Airbus A340s, Boeing 777s, and now the latest generation Boeing 737-8 Maxes. And yes, it's got a very good level of service, and it's been that one great example of a state-owned airline that has actually been really profitable. It has had wonderful support from the state in terms of what we call a whole state aviation policy. Yes, it's had a lot of protection from the state against other carriers, but you can't take anything away from the success of the airline. And looking at a slightly wider, more continental basis, it's particularly tragic, this accident, because the whole of Africa has really fixed up its safety record. It went from being as bad as 6 times worse than the world average 5-6 years ago to being actually one of the best areas in the world. It hadn't had a fatal jet aircraft accident in the past 2 years. So this was its third fatal-free year accident of aircraft operations. This is a real setback for Ethiopian and for Africa.
Yeah, it certainly is a great shame. Just to wrap this up, and I find it hard not to bring this up in the interview, we're talking about plane crashes, we're talking about the loss of lives, and a devastating story. And there, in the Kempton Park Magistrates Court, was an SAA pilot who appeared yesterday. He was finally arrested after faking a pilot's license for 20 years. How is this possible, Guy? Help me out here.
Yeah, yes, well, it's, I suppose, surprisingly possible because we tend to trust pilots with our lives just as we trust doctors with our lives. And the Civil Aviation Authority, the South African Civil Aviation Authority's pilot licensing system is really just little pieces of paper you slip into plastic pockets in a booklet. They're extremely easy to forge. I have to point out, though, that it's not as though this pilot was faking that he had a pilot license. He had a proper pilot license. He had a commercial pilot's license. And not only that, but every year he had passed the 2 very rigorous flight tests that South African Airways gives all their pilots, one in the first half of the year, one in the second half of the year. So there's no question about his competency. It's just that 20 years ago, he fudged or pretended to have the highest level of pilot's license, which is called an airline transport pilot license, whereas he only had a commercial license. And once he'd been caught in that lie, I suspect he got trapped in that lie. And in fact, that's why he never actually applied or accepted a command upgrade to become a captain, why he was always just a first officer. There wasn't a threat to safety, but we'd expect our pilots to be absolutely above reproach in terms of just scruples. Clearly he failed badly in that regard.
Yeah, certainly did. Guy, thanks very much for talking to us. Guy Leitch is the editor and publisher of SA Flyer magazine, talking to us about this latest disaster, Ethiopian Airlines, the crash on the Boeing 737 MAX A fleet, and just basically talking to this fleet that has seen many airlines around the world now grounding this particular aircraft. Let's take a break. We're going to get more information from Ethiopia in a short while when we speak to